I'm Michael Griffith. I'm the marketing manager for Segrest Farms. For those of you who don't know who we are one of the largest suppliers and producers of ornamental fish, not just in the country, but in the world. This is Mike Tuccrinardi. He's on the advisory board for Project Piaba. He's also senior editor at Reef to Rainforest Media. So if there's something that we shouldn't have to tell you guys, is that issues around sustainability and conservation are complicated topics with few, if any, black and white answers. One thing that's unquestionable is that every company, regardless of their industry, should be striving to operate within a sustainable framework, because by definition, if you're not sustainable, sooner or later, you're going to fail. So there's a lot of answers being thrown out there right now about what it means to be sustainable and how do we promote conservation. The problem is a lot of them tend to be overly simplified and ignore some important concepts. In order for anything to be fully sustainable, you need to support the 3 pillars of sustainability. It needs to be environmentally, economically, and socially sustainable. So within the fish trade, the easy, simple answer for many years has just been, don't take fish from the wild. So what we've been focusing on for decades is increasing the amount of aquaculture and captive breeding we're doing. At this point, more than 90% of the freshwater fish you're going to find available for sale come from captive bred sources. There's definitely a lot of room for growth in marine fish. Organizations such as Rising Tide Conservation are doing a lot of work on this. There's constantly progress being made, and we are moving forward on that. But the problem with this solution, this idea of just don't take fish from the wild, leave them where they are, is that even though it sounds good, it's kind of based on this idea that there's an almost one-to-one relationship between the number of fish you're taking from the wild and the overall health of that population. The problem is that's not really the case. Every ecosystem has a specific carrying capacity, which is how many of a given organism they can support at any given time. And one of the key guiding principles to fishery is to stay within this carrying capacity. So one of the things you need to think about and ask when you're looking at wild collection is not just, is the population able to replenish itself, but also what other effects does it have? So one of the things that you're going to see, especially with Project Piaba, is that wild collection is not automatically unsustainable. It's definitely possible to over-collect, pull more fish than what can be replenished, but not all wild collection is bad. So in the late 1980s, there were some researchers from Brazil who wanted to know what other effects collection on the Rio Negro in Brazil had. I'm going to hand it over to Mike to talk about what they found and the program they developed.
Sure, thanks, Michael. Excuse me. So I'm just going to briefly try and explain our unorthodox solution that Project Piaba has come upon and where we are right now. How's that better? Okay. So to explain what we do, first I got to explain where we work. The Rio Negro is the second largest tributary of the Amazon River. It goes from Colombia all the way down into Brazil, right about the epicenter of the Amazon basin. And there has been ornamental fish collecting here since the 1950s, becoming a large-scale industry in the 70s and 80s. And at the peak years of the fishery, over 60% of cash incomes in the region derived from this fishery in some way, and several thousand families were employed full-time as ornamental fish collectors. The basis of this fishery is this little beautiful fish, the cardinal tetra, which if any of you had aquariums, you probably recognize this. It's one of the classics. Here's a few shots of the fishery in its early days from the 1950s all the way to the late 80s. The fishery relies on skilled tradesmen collecting specific species and transporting them alive downriver to Manaus. And even today, the fishery very much looks like this. The techniques and the technology, the logistics haven't changed all that much. So enter Project Piaba. In the late 1980s, as Michael said, a group sponsored by the University of Amazonas in Brazil started a strictly research-focused group that brought in fisheries biologists, anthropologists, sociologists, ichthyologists, a lot of other ologists together to do an interdisciplinary study of this fishery with the intention that there's a lot of fish coming out of here. Surely this must be decimating the environment. What surprised everybody was that they found, as they dug into this fishery, that not only did it seem like they weren't taking out more fish than the fishery could sustain, but it was actually driving conservation in the region. Now, this is possible because of the Amazon's unique annual flood pattern. So most fish species, their reproductive cycle is tied to the rise and fall of the water every year. They produce tons of offspring when the waters are rising. They go into these flooded forests that are full of nutrients and food sources. As the waters decline, most of those fish end up in little dried up pools and die. So few offspring survive the dry season. Now the fishers learned where these pools are, and they collect the fish from these stagnant pools that are otherwise moribund, or otherwise they're dying. So these fish are not going to reproduce. They're pretty much a dead population anyways, and by doing that, collecting there, you can collect fish, a lot of fish, and not have a major impact on the overall population. So with that discovery, especially towards the late 90s, we realized that the project needed to shift from pure research towards advocacy, towards activism. We found that this fishery was worth promoting and preserving. Aquarium fish collecting, because of the cash income it provides to people, it prevents really, really systemic issues in the Amazon like slash and burn agriculture, like illegal logging, like cattle ranching and illegal gold mining. All of these things, I've spent a lot of time in the Amazon, and personally I can attest to the impact this has in the overall region. Regions where fish collecting in the Rio Negro happen don't have these problems. It's largely because of a sustainable cash income provided by the trade. So here's the conservation outcomes we have from this project. Habitats protected. We have preservation of habitat not just for the fish themselves, like the cardinal tetras, but for the other species, the river turtles, river dolphins, macaws, etc. We have massive amounts of carbon that remain sequestered in this productive environment. And we found that the project meets all 17 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So today we're working on best handling practices and trainings in the field to improve the fishery, to make sure that the fish get to the consumer in the healthiest and best way possible. We continue to work in field research, fisheries research, etc. We share the message through zoo and aquarium initiatives and exhibits, so we're reaching millions of viewers every year through public aquariums and zoos. Of course, we do a lot of hobby outreach, and probably most importantly is our collaboration with our partners like Segrest Farms in the industry itself to try and shift their sourcing to these sustainable options. And with that, back to Michael.
So over the past few years, Segrest Farms has been taking a more direct and hands-on approach with Project Piaba, working with them on things like better quality foods to feed the fish while they're being held, acclimating the fish throughout the supply chain in order to prepare them for what they're going to be experiencing once they reach wholesalers, retailers here in the US. We've been working with them a lot recently on establishing better supply routes and options to keep them from basically just sitting around waiting to be transported. And all these projects aim to reduce losses, not just throughout the supply chain, but also after they arrive in the US. With the thought being fewer losses, not only can we supply more fish in the US without any additional collection, but we can also make those collectors be more profitable. And this whole idea of using wild collection as a method to protect wild populations seems pretty counterintuitive at first. It takes a while to kind of wrap your mind around. Kind of the old answer, just leave the animals alone, don't mess with them, seems solid, it seems like a good idea. But the problem is that it doesn't support all three pillars. It's not economically sustainable for those communities who have the most power to protect those ecosystems. By having a strong, healthy fishery, not only can we prevent those communities from turning to logging and mining and ranching, but you can also give them a concrete incentive to protect the habitats in order to keep the populations of ornamental fish thriving. And that incentive can definitely be a powerful force. Thanks.